35 Christian men knelt in a dusty, stark line. Their hands were rough, calloused, and now cruelly bound behind their backs. For a fleeting, terrifying moment, each one knew with absolute certainty that this was the end of their earthly journey. The air, already thick with the unforgiving heat of the Nigerian sun, seemed to grow heavy with silent anticipation. Executioners, menacing silhouettes against the blazing sky, were raising their weapons. And then, at that very second, the second where hope usually expires, something impossible happened. Something no one, not the victims, not the murderers, not the silent, horrified onlookers, saw coming. What I'm about to share with you did not happen in the distant past. It occurred just 3 months ago in the volatile landscape of northern Nigeria. This is a story that defies logic, a testimony so profound it sounds like it was lifted directly from the pages of the Old Testament. Yet it is completely, verifiably real. 35 brave believers stood or knelt at the precipice of death for the sole crime of their faith. And what the Almighty did next will send a profound chill right down your spine. This is far more than just another moving testimony. It is irrefutable proof that the same God who commanded the Red Sea to divide is still actively, dramatically, and miraculously intervening in the affairs of men today. Let me take you there. It was a Tuesday morning, the kind of morning that offers no relief, in Kaduna State, Nigeria. By 9 a.m., the sun was already a brutal, unyielding presence, and the dust of the dry season hung everywhere, blurring the world into a single, hazy expanse of ochre and heat. Pastor Samuel Adebayo, a man whose quiet strength was forged in years of hardship, was leading the regular morning prayer meeting at Grace Community Church. The gathering was small, intimate, marked by the fervent whispers of faith. Then they heard it, the unmistakable, low, growing rumble of multiple motorcycles. If you have never lived in northern Nigeria, you must understand the deep, primal fear that sound strikes into the hearts of a Christian minority. It is not the sound of casual traffic. It is the signature sound of trouble. Usually armed groups, ruthless and precise, whose objective is to terrorize and target Christians. Pastor Samuel had survived this terror before. Just 2 years prior, his small church had been shattered by an attack during a Sunday service, a day that cost them 12 beloved members. Yet he had refused to surrender to fear. He had refused to shutter the doors. So when the engine noise swelled from a distant hum to a roaring certainty, he knew. He knew exactly what unspeakable horror was about to unfold. The church doors were not opened, they were burst open. 27 armed men, a terrifying tide of aggression, stormed into the humble sanctuary, screaming commands in a mixture of broken English and Hausa. Their assault rifles waved wildly. The congregation, perhaps 60 souls strong, a vulnerable mix of women, men, and gleaming children, instantly dropped to the floor, a collective gasp swallowed by the concrete silence. The attackers wore military-style fatigues, their faces sinisterly obscured by dark cloths. Their leader, a figure of daunting height and cold, piercing eyes, was their voice. "All of you stand up slowly. No sudden movements or we shoot." His voice was ragged, menacing. Mama Rose, the revered elderly grandmother who always occupied the front row, was shaking uncontrollably, her frail body barely able to obey the command. Her teenage grandson, David, gripped her arm, helping her up while desperately trying to mask the sheer terror written on his own youthful face. Young mothers instinctively tightened their grip on their infants, silently praying that no cry would provoke the armed intruders. The leader strode to the front, his heavy boots sounding like hammers on the concrete floor. "We are here for one reason," he announced, the words hanging heavy and poisonous in the stale air. "You people have been spreading lies about our religion. You have been converting our people to your false faith. Today, this stops." Pastor Samuel, a pillar of calm amid the storm, took one steadying breath and stepped forward. "Sir, we are a people of peace," he countered, his voice remarkably steady. "We have done nothing but worship our God and serve our community." The leader spat on the floor, a gesture of ultimate contempt, then laughed, a brittle, joyless sound that felt like sandpaper on the skin. "Your God," he sneered. "Where is your God now? Why doesn't he save you?" What happened next was the decision that would irrevocably change everything, launching a single prayer into the heavens that would bring down the impossible. The leader barked an order in Hausa, and the separation began. The gunmen roughly shoved the women and children into a corner of the church. The men, all 35 of them, spanning the spectrum from nervous teenagers to dignified elderly grandfathers, were forced to the opposite side. "You have a choice," the leader announced, pacing slowly, like a predator assessing a confined herd. "Denounce this Jesus, convert to Islam, swear allegiance to Allah, and you live. Refuse, and you die here today." The silence that followed was absolute, terrifying. In that church, you could hear the labored breathing of the congregation. You could hear the frantic, uneven rhythm of hearts beating a desperate tattoo against their ribs. The women wept soundlessly, their eyes fixed on their fathers, sons, and husbands, facing an ultimatum that felt more devastating than death itself. Then Pastor Samuel did the unthinkable. He looked the leader dead in the eye, his own gaze blazing with a fierce, quiet defiance. "We choose Jesus," he stated. One by one, the answer was echoed. David, the teenager who should have been concerned with school exams, affirmed it. Old Joseph, who relied on his walking stick, confirmed it. Michael, the young father whose wife was clutching their newborn across the room, whispered it. All 35 men chose death over renouncing their faith. The leader's face, already hard, contorted with a cold, terrifying rage. "Foolish people, you choose to die for nothing." They were dragged outside, behind the church building. The women and children were forced to watch the awful procession through the dusty, unforgiving windows. Can you grasp that terror? To be a mother, watching your beloved being hauled away, not knowing if their face is the last you will ever see? The execution site was a bleak patch of bare red dirt, sparse, scraggly trees offering no shade from the brutal overhead sun. The attackers roughly forced the 35 men to kneel in a single rigid line, facing away from the church. Their hands were lashed tightly behind their backs with coarse rope that immediately began to chafe and bite into their wrists. Pastor Samuel was centered in the line of doomed men. To his left, the young David. To his right, Elder Johnson, a man who had survived over 70 years of poverty and persecution. "A day of terror and bloodshed." And then the pastor's prayer echoed across the red dirt. "A day of faith and hope all day long. A day of faith and hope all day long. A day of faith and hope all day long. A day of faith and hope all day long." "Any last words before you meet your false god?" the leader taunted, savoring his moment of power. Pastor Samuel tilted his head back, seeking the relentless glare of the sun. His face was a mask of sweat and dust, but his voice when it came was clear, carrying a transcendent strength. "Father, if it is your will, take us home to be with you. But if you have other plans, we trust in your power. Show these men who you really are." The other men joined in, a swelling chorus of faith in the face of oblivion. Some whispered prayers for their families. Some spoke bold, unwavering petitions for their nation and even for their executioners. Young David was heard reciting the familiar, comforting words of the psalm. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want."
It long silenced by the distance. But here is the most astounding detail. The fact that convinced even the most cynical residents of the area that they had witnessed an authentic, undeniable miracle. The storm had been completely and perfectly localized. The torrential downpour, the blinding hail, the ground-shaking thunder, all of it had occurred in a radius of perhaps 2 square miles directly surrounding Grace Community Church. Just 5 miles away, the red earth remained bone dry. The official weather station in the nearest town recorded 0 rainfall that day. Local farmers working their fields just a few kilometers distant testified to seeing the dark, threatening clouds and the intense rain in the distance, but not a single drop had fallen on their land. The phenomenon had been precise. It had formed over the church, executed its divine purpose, and vanished without a trace, leaving a muddy, miraculous circle in its wake. The news spread through the region like wildfire. Muslims, Christians, and those of other faiths, everyone was talking about what had transpired at Grace Community Church. Even some of the established local Islamic leaders were forced to concede that the God of the Christians had in an unprecedented and spectacular fashion displayed his power that morning. Pastor Samuel later shared that in the weeks following the incident, the church experienced more conversions and commitment to faith than he had seen in years of regular ministry. People who had been paralyzed by fear, who had been afraid to even approach the church doors, suddenly began showing up. They weren't coming for prosperity or comfort. They were coming to know the God who could summon a storm to save his people. The government authorities, mandated to investigate such a high-profile incident, questioned witnesses, meticulously examined the site, and reviewed the non-existent weather records. Their official report, unable to grasp the truth, stated simply that 35 Christian men had been threatened with execution but had escaped during an unusual weather event. Even the secular authorities could offer no credible, natural explanation. But for the 35 men who had knelt in that red mud, feeling the rain wash over them as their bonds spontaneously loosened, there was no room for doubt or scientific hypothesis. They had witnessed a genuine act of God. David, the teenager, shared that the experience had entirely changed his perspective on faith. He confided, "Before that day, I believed in God because my parents taught me to. After that day, I knew God personally. I had felt his hand upon my life." Elder Johnson, then 72, spoke with the unshakable certainty of a man who had stared death in the face and seen God intervene. He declared, "I was ready to die for Jesus that day, but Jesus wasn't ready to let me die. He still has work for me to do." Pastor Samuel, a shepherd who had faced the wolf and seen God send a deluge of protection, continues to lead Grace Community Church. The building has since been repaired and expanded twice to accommodate the flood of new members. He says that every time he prays now, he remembers the simple, desperate prayer he lifted to the blazing sky. "Show these men who you really are." He says, "God answered that prayer in a way I never could have imagined." He didn't just show the attackers who he was, he showed the entire region. The attackers were never apprehended, but local reports suggested something even more miraculous than their escape was unfolding. Some of them, utterly terrified and shaken by the divine intervention they had witnessed, reportedly began to convert to Christianity. The leader himself, the man whose rage had been eclipsed by the storm, was rumored to have been seen attending a Christian service in a neighboring town, though this detail remains unconfirmed. What is certain is that the story is not merely about a dramatic, localized rescue. It is a modern-day testament to the same power that saved Daniel from the hungry jaws of the lions, that protected Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the inferno, and that carved a path through the Red Sea for Moses. That God is still working miracles today. These men were not spiritual giants, but ordinary Christians who chose faith over fear, and in doing so, activated the extraordinary.
Pastor Samuel is the first to admit his fear that Tuesday morning. "I'm human," he told me simply. "I was terrified." Yet his life is now a living proof of a powerful truth. Being scared doesn't mean you stop trusting God. It means you trust Him even when you're scared. This is the core lesson we all must internalize. Faith is not the absence of fear. It is the choice to trust God in the face of it. The impact of that day went far beyond the 43 minutes of the storm. What happened next is a living, breathing demonstration that when God moves, the ripple effects can transform entire communities and heal wounds inflicted by violence. 3 days after the miracle, a nervous, cautious figure appeared at Grace Community Church. He was constantly looking over his shoulder, clearly terrified of being seen near the Christian sanctuary. Pastor Samuel recognized him immediately. He was one of the attackers. The young man, Ibrahim, could not have been much older than 25. When he finally stood before Pastor Samuel, his hands were trembling. Through halting, broken English, he confessed that he had not been able to sleep since the incident. Every time he closed his eyes, he was back outside the church, seeing the apocalyptic storm, hearing the deafening thunder, and feeling the stinging impacts of the hail on his skin. "Pastor," he whispered, his voice cracking with emotion, "your God, He is real. I saw what He did. I was there." Ibrahim explained that he had been coerced into joining the militant group. His family was desperately poor, and they had promised him a substantial payment. He thought it would be simple, just scare some Christians and perhaps steal a few items. He had never signed up to witness a spontaneous act of divine weather warfare. When the storm hit, Ibrahim knew they were facing a force beyond their weapons. The other men, he shared, they were scared too, but they won't admit it. They keep saying it was just strange weather, but I know better. I felt the power of your God that day. Pastor Samuel's response was a perfect echo of Christ's love. Instead of raising the alarm, instead of calling the authorities or seeking any form of revenge, he invited Ibrahim to sit and hear the message of Christ's love and forgiveness. That conversation stretched for 4 hours, a divine discourse in the very place Ibrahim had come to commit murder. By the end of it, the young man was on his knees, not in forced submission, but in repentance, crying and asking Jesus to forgive him and take residence in his heart. The very young man who had come to kill Christians became a dedicated Christian himself. But Ibrahim's conversion came with a severe price. When his family discovered his newfound faith, they immediately disowned him, cutting him off completely. His former militant allies, fueled by rage and betrayal, placed a bounty on his head. He was forced to flee his village and start his life over from zero. Pastor Samuel and the community of Grace Community Church welcomed Ibrahim with an open embrace, taking him in as one of their own. They helped him secure honest work, provided him with safe accommodation, and most importantly, they extended him total, unconditional forgiveness. There were no caveats, no probationary periods, just the pure healing love of Christ exemplified through their community. Ibrahim now dedicates his life to youth ministry at the church, traveling to other communities to share his powerful testimony about the transformative grace of God. His story has become an enduring testament to the miracle itself. "I came to kill them," Ibrahim often tells gathered crowds, "but their God captured my heart instead." The news of the extraordinary event spread rapidly beyond Nigeria's borders. International Christian organizations meticulously documented the testimony. Persecution watchdog groups conducted thorough investigations and confirmed all the details. Major Christian publications amplified the story, carrying it to a global audience. But the story's trajectory did not stop there. It resonated deeply within the Muslim community of northern Nigeria. While not every individual converted, the story gained enough traction to ignite open conversations between Christians and Muslims, dialogues that had been dormant for decades. Dr. Ramina Hassan, A respected Muslim professor at Ahmadu Bello University was quoted in a local newspaper reflecting on the event. "Whether you believe in miracles or not," she stated, "what happened at that church has made people think. It's opened doors for dialogue between our communities that have been closed for too long." Even certain local Islamic scholars publicly acknowledged that the God of the Christians had undeniably demonstrated a powerful force that day. While they did not change their own faith, they gained a palpable respect for the Christian faith that had been absent before. The local government was compelled to publicly address the incident due to the widespread public discourse. The state governor, himself a Muslim, issued an official statement unequivocally condemning the attack on the church and pledging greater protection for all religious communities. Significantly, he acknowledged that extraordinary events had taken place that day. While he could not bring himself to use the word miracle, the proximity of his official language spoke volumes. The inexplicable weather phenomenon became a subject of intense scientific curiosity. Meteorologists from the University of Lagos traveled to the site, interviewing witnesses, studying the historical weather patterns, and meticulously examining satellite data from the day in question. Their conclusion was a stunning admission of their limitations. "We cannot explain how such a localized, intense storm system could develop and dissipate so quickly in an area with no atmospheric conditions conducive to storm formation." In layman's terms, the scientists were forced to admit that the event defied every known natural law. Dr. Michael Okafor, the lead meteorologist on the investigative team, told local media, "In 30 years of studying weather patterns in this region, I have never seen anything like this. The storm appeared to form directly over a very specific location, lasted exactly long enough to disrupt the events taking place there, and then disappeared completely. From a scientific standpoint, it defies explanation." Meanwhile, the 35 men who had been saved were undergoing their own spiritual transformations. Facing death and receiving a supernatural deliverance of this magnitude is an experience that permanently alters a person's relationship with God. Michael, the young father, shared that before that terrifying Tuesday, his faith had been comfortable, consisting mostly of Sunday attendance and rote prayers before meals. After experiencing God's power so tangibly, his relationship with Christ deepened into an unshakable conviction. "I used to pray hoping God would hear me. Now I pray knowing He hears me, because I've seen what He can do." Michael immediately started a home prayer group that now meets every Tuesday morning, the same day of the week they were nearly executed. The group has grown to over 40 regular members, and they spend their time praying specifically for the persecuted church worldwide, carrying a profound empathy for those in similar peril. David, the teenager, made a decision that surprised his entire family. Instead of being traumatized by the near execution, he felt an undeniable, powerful call to ministry. At 17, he announced his intention to become a pastor. His grandmother, Mama Rose, voiced the natural concern, "Haven't you been through enough danger for your faith?" David's answer was simple, filled with the wisdom of a survivor. "Grandmama, God saved my life for a reason. I need to find out what that reason is." David, the young man whose faith had been tested in the crucible of execution, is now studying theology through a distance learning program while remaining an active and vital part of Grace Community Church. He preaches occasionally, and he has a specialized, compelling ministry to other young people who face social pressure to compromise their Christian beliefs. "When your friends make fun of you for being a Christian," David tells them with quiet intensity, "remember that Jesus is worth dying for, and if He's worth dying for, He's definitely worth living for." Elder Johnson, the 72-year-old elder, experienced what he describes as a powerful, renewed purpose. He had been contemplating retirement, feeling that he was too old to be truly effective in his church role. After the miracle, he declared, "I'm just getting started. God didn't save my life so I could sit at home and wait to die. He saved me so I could tell people what He can do." Elder Johnson now leads a weekly Bible study that focuses specifically on God's miraculous interventions throughout biblical history and modern times. His class has become so popular that it had to be relocated to the main church auditorium to accommodate the crowd hungry for stories of God's power. But perhaps the most profound change occurred in Pastor Samuel himself. He had always believed in God's power intellectually, a core tenet of his faith. But surviving the storm shifted something tectonic deep inside him. Before that day, I preached about miracles from the Bible. Now I preach about the miracle-working God who is still active today. There is a difference. His sermons gained a new, breathtaking authority. His prayers became bolder, laced with the confidence of one who has seen the impossible. His faith became an unshakable anchor that influences everyone who comes into contact with him. The church has since ballooned from 60 members to over 400 in the months following the incident. But more significant than the numerical growth is the exponential increase in the congregation's spiritual maturity and sheer boldness. They are not afraid anymore. They still practice security precautions. They are not reckless, but they are no longer driven by the paralyzing grip of fear. They are motivated by an absolute, fearless faith in a God who commands the wind and the rain. The women of the church, those who endured the agony of watching their loved ones led to certain death, have formed their own powerful prayer ministry. They gather every morning at 5 a.m. to pray specifically for Christians facing persecution across the globe. Mrs. Sarah Adebayo, Pastor Samuel's wife, leads this dedicated group. "We know what it feels like to think you're about to lose everything," she explains, her voice heavy with deep understanding. "So when we pray for persecuted believers, we're not just saying words, we're praying from experience." This women's prayer group has organically connected with similar ministries in other countries, receiving urgent prayer requests from Christians in places like China, North Korea, Iran, and countless other regions where faith carries a deadly price. The women of northern Nigeria are now interceding for believers they will never meet in countries they will never visit because they understand the reality of suffering for faith in a way many Christians never will. Even the children who witnessed the traumatic event have been affected, but in profoundly positive ways. Instead of being traumatized, they have developed a deep instinctive confidence in God's protective power. Little Grace, who was only 8 years old when she watched her father being dragged away by armed men, now prays with a simple, breathtaking boldness that often amazes the adults.
Dear God, little Grace prayed recently in the children's church, her voice small but certain. Thank you for sending the rain to save my daddy. If bad people try to hurt us again, please send more rain, or maybe lightning next time. You're really good at weather. The purity and confidence of her faith represent a beautiful hope. A generation of children growing up with first-hand knowledge that their God still performs miracles in the real world. The story has galvanized Christians in other parts of Nigeria who face similar escalating persecution. Churches that had been forced to meet in secret for years found new courage and began holding public services once more. Pastors who were weary and considering abandoning the ministry found their callings powerfully re-energized. A regional network of churches now holds an annual Storm Sunday service, gathering on the anniversary of the miracle to commemorate God's faithfulness and pray for the continued protection of believers.
But the impact of the event extends beyond the Christian community, becoming a central talking point for promoting religious tolerance throughout northern Nigeria. Even people who dismiss the supernatural aspects of the story acknowledge that the event spurred necessary conversations between communities that were long overdue. Local interfaith councils organized immediate peace meetings. Community leaders from different religious backgrounds started collaborating on development projects aimed at reducing religious tensions. The miracle did not solve all the region's complex problems, but it cracked open the door for dialogue where only silence and fear had existed before. Some of the most powerful and unexpected testimonies came from the local police officers who investigated the incident. Officers, speaking privately and anonymously, confessed that the overwhelming evidence convinced them that something genuinely supernatural had occurred. One officer admitted to a local journalist, "I've investigated hundreds of crimes. I've seen people lie and create false stories. But when 35 people tell you the exact same incredible story, and the physical evidence, the sudden localized mud, the lack of official weather records supports what they're saying, you have to consider that maybe it really happened." Medical professionals in the area were also deeply impacted. Dr. Ruth Adamu, who treated several of the men for minor rope injuries and exposure, stated that the experience fundamentally challenged her scientific worldview. "As a doctor, I'm trained to look for natural explanations for everything," Dr. Adamu explained. But when you have multiple patients telling you about a localized hailstorm in the dry season that lasted exactly long enough to save their lives, you start questioning whether natural explanations are truly sufficient for everything that happens in this world. The economic ripple effect was also surprising. Grace Community Church and the surrounding area witnessed a significant increase in visitors. Christians from other parts of Nigeria and from abroad, all drawn by a desire to see the site of the miracle. This influx brought much-needed business to local hotels, restaurants, and shops. Musa Abdullahi, a local Muslim business owner who manages a small hotel near the church, told me, "I don't know if what they say happened really happened, but these Christian visitors are respectful people who spend money in our community and cause no trouble. They are welcome here." The newly transformed relationship between Christians and Muslims in this specific region has become a model for other areas struggling with religious conflict. Government officials have studied the dynamics to understand how such profound religious tensions could be so dramatically mitigated. The state governor, a Muslim himself, was compelled to acknowledge the events publicly. While he was careful not to use the word miracle, his statement was a powerful admission that extraordinary, unexplainable events had taken place that day, underscoring the necessity of interfaith harmony and protection for all citizens. Of course, the story is not without its skeptics. Some suggest the men somehow staged the entire event or that the weather was merely an incredibly unusual coincidence that the victims interpreted religiously. But Pastor Samuel, addressing the skepticism in his sermons, often says, "Some people will never believe no matter what evidence they see. That's their choice. But we who were there, we who felt the rain, we who walked away alive when we should have died, we know what we experienced and will spend the rest of our lives telling people about it." Here is what the skeptic simply cannot explain away: the absolute, undeniable transformation in the lives of the people involved. You cannot fake the internal change that turned Ibrahim, the former attacker, into a humble Christian youth minister. You cannot manufacture the fierce boldness and unwavering faith that those 35 men now demonstrate. And you cannot conjure the profound, positive community transformation that has occurred in the region. The story has been meticulously documented by multiple Christian organizations, investigated by journalists, and verified by government authorities. But more powerful than all the official documentation are the 35 living men in northern Nigeria who are walking, breathing proof that God sent a storm at the exact necessary moment. Every breath they take, every word they speak, every prayer they offer is a living testimony to the power and faithfulness of God. And that is only the beginning of how this single miracle continues to impact lives. But here is the piece of the story that gives me chills every time I revisit it. Recall Pastor Samuel's prayer as the executioners raised their weapons. "Father, if you have other plans, we trust in your power. Show these men who you really are." God didn't just show the attackers who he was, he demonstrated it to the entire world. 6 months after the miracle, a message arrived through our ministry's website. It was from a man named Chenny in China. He wrote, "I heard about the Nigerian Christians on an underground Christian radio broadcast. I am a house church pastor in rural China. Last week, police surrounded our meeting and threatened to arrest us all unless we stopped gathering." Chenny continued, "I remembered the story of the 35 men who chose death over denial. When the police gave us the same choice, stop meeting or face imprisonment, our entire church said together, 'We choose Jesus.' The police left without arresting anyone." That message broke my heart and simultaneously galvanized my spirit. Here was a pastor in China, an ocean away, being radically encouraged and emboldened by the testimony of believers in Nigeria. The miracle was not just local, it was global. Since then, similar messages have poured in from believers in Iran, North Korea, India, and dozens of other countries where Christians face daily, relentless persecution. The story of those 35 men has become an inexhaustible source of courage for believers worldwide, confronting their own impossible situations.
A pastor in Iran wrote, "When they threatened my family, I remembered the Nigerian Christians. I asked myself, what would they do? The answer was clear. Stand firm. Trust God." The persecution actually stopped after we refused to back down. A woman in North Korea, smuggling out a letter, shared, "We heard about the storm God sent to save his people in Africa. We pray he will send his protection over us too. Until then, we keep meeting in secret, knowing that the same God who saved the Nigerian Christians watches over us." This is the profound realization I want you to grasp. That storm was not just about saving 35 lives in Nigeria. It was about demonstrating to Christians everywhere that our God is still the same God. He is the same God who divided the Red Sea, who shut the mouths of the lions, and who raised the dead. Every believer facing persecution now has a tangible, modern-day example of God's miraculous, decisive intervention. They have undeniable proof that He has not stopped performing miracles. They have evidence that He still responds to the desperate, faithful prayers of His people in impossible situations. The attackers, in their malice, thought they were merely executing some local Christians. They had no idea they were throwing down a gauntlet to the Creator of the universe. They had no idea their actions would result in a testimony that would fan the flames of faith and encourage believers on every single continent. Pastor Samuel shared a recent insight with me that perfectly encapsulates the bigger picture. He said, "I used to think God saved us from those men. Now I understand He saved us for the world." Our testimony was never just about us. It was about showing everyone that Jesus is still in the miracle business. Pause and think about this for a moment. In a world where Christians are constantly pressured to keep their faith quiet, to compromise their convictions, where global persecution against believers is at an all-time high,
God chose a dusty patch of ground behind a small church in northern Nigeria to deliver a spectacular, undeniable reminder of who is really in control. He didn't send legions of angels, though he certainly could have. He didn't incinerate the attackers with bolts of lightning, though he has that power. He sent rain. Simple, natural rain that arrived at the precise, crucial moment in the exact necessary place with the perfect intensity to save exactly 35 lives. Why rain? Because rain is a phenomenon everyone understands. You don't need a theology degree to recognize that a localized hailstorm does not just appear out of nowhere during the absolute peak of the dry season. You don't need to be a Christian to know that such weather defies all natural explanation. God utilized the simplest, most undeniable miracle possible so that no one could miss the message. The message was clear. He is still God. He still cares intimately about his people. And he still possesses the sovereign power to intervene in human affairs exactly when and how he chooses. Those 35 men didn't just receive their lives back that Tuesday. They received a mission. They became living proof that faith in Jesus Christ is worth any sacrifice, because the God we serve is infinitely greater than any threat, earthly or spiritual, that we face. Their story has now reached millions of people across the globe. It has been translated into dozens of languages, shared in underground house churches, taught in Bible studies, and proclaimed from pulpits on every continent. But more importantly than the reach, the story is actively changing hearts. People who had given up on God are experiencing a radical rediscovery of faith. Believers who were compromising their convictions are finding the courage to stand firm. Pastors who were weary and ready to quit are finding a profound, renewed strength to continue their callings. The 35 men who knelt in that mud are still living their ordinary lives. They go to work, they raise their families, and they deal with everyday problems just like the rest of us. But they carry an undeniable, precious certainty. The absolute knowledge that their God is real, that he loves them unconditionally, and that he has the power to do anything. That certainty is contagious. It spreads to everyone who hears their story. It is a powerful reminder to all of us that we serve a God who is not limited by natural laws, human politics, or mortal threats. When you face your own impossible situation, and you will face them, remember the Nigerian Christians. Remember that the very God who sent a storm to save them is the same God who is listening to your prayer right now. He may not send a spectacular storm for you. He may not intervene in the dramatic way you expect, but I promise you this: he will be with you. He will sustain you, and he will orchestrate everything for his ultimate glory and your ultimate good. The miracle in Nigeria is not just a story about what God did. It is a profound, living revelation of who God is. It is absolute proof that our faith is not mere a hope. It is a certainty. Our hope is not misplaced, and our God is not distant or powerless. He is the same yesterday, today, and forever. The God who controlled the weather to save 35 Christians in Nigeria is the very same God who controls every intricate detail of your life. Trust him with your impossible situations. He specializes in them. Subscribe to this channel to hear more testimonies of God's miraculous power being displayed around the world.